This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Thomas Geoghegan has written a book called Only One Thing Can Save Us. What is that one thing? Reinvent the labor movement. Political scientist Thomas Schaller explains why Republicans own Congress, but Democrats own the White House. And Bill Press talks with Congresswoman Donna Edwards about the Obama legislative agenda. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Labor lawyer Thomas Geoghegan says everyone in the Democratic Party has a stake in re-energizing the labor movement, and that unions need to refocus and reinvent themselves. And we say hello to Thomas Geoghegan, graduate of Harvard Law School, and has represented labor unions and employee groups in many significant cases in various United States district courts and courts of appeals. He is also the author of a new book, Only One Thing Can Save Us, Why Our Country Needs a New Kind of Labor Movement. Thomas Geoghegan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're happy to have you. Everyone seems to be an independent contractor now. Companies are finding ways to have more production with fewer workers. Has the labor movement disappeared?
No, it's still out there, but it needs to reinvent itself, and that's why I wrote Only One Thing Can Save Us. We need to have a Democratic Party that is much more of a labor party, I should say, to America's Democrats. And we need actually not just to raise people's wages or stop the growth of inequality. We need to have a more democratic society, a more democratic way of life in our workplace, in our schools, and of course, in the general republic. And we need to mobilize people to come back into the system. We can't do that. We can't get Democrats elected unless we have a labor movement that is going to pull those people in and bring us back into a functioning democracy, which we don't have if you've got one-third of the country voting in midterms and barely more than half in presidential elections. So that's why I wrote the book, a labor movement that's going to reach out, pull people into the system, so to speak, into the polity, the republic, and because we are democratizing our way of life.
Mm-hmm. Is this kind of those things that you just mentioned in that answer? Is that sort of the blueprint or the start of the blueprint for building a new labor movement?
Well, the book, Only One Thing Can Save Us, has much more specific proposals than that. I mean, it argues for for doing really three things and doing three very hard things all at once. One is changing the labor movement, getting rid of the principle of exclusive representation, opening up labor even to representing smaller groups of workers, arguing for more disruption, because in a gridlock political system, the only way to really get results, and we saw that in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, is to disrupt. Even if you lose, you could see that in the fast food strikes, which didn't persuade the McDonald's and the Wendy's of the world to raise wages, but got minimum wage up to the top of the political agenda. You have to engage in more strikes, disruption, and do that not through because you're representing a majority of workers, but representing a militant minority. The second thing we have to do is change our corporate model, move from a stockholder model, which is dysfunctional anyway because stockholders really aren't running these companies, to a stakeholder model, more like Northern Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, where you have working people electing directors to the board. And I talk about how we might start doing that, at least in the not-for-profit sector. And finally, we do have to change our political model, and we can do that if if the Democratic Party stops trying to push the idea that the way to deal with inequality is getting everybody into college, and recognizes that this is a high school nation. I mean, 70% of the adult population just has high school degrees, and starts orienting itself towards making it making those high school jobs worthwhile. That's what we have to do.
We're speaking to Thomas Geoghegan. He's the author of a new book, Only One Thing Can Save Us, Why Our Country Needs a New Kind of Labor Movement. Where does the blame lie? You critique President Obama. What did he do or not do to help the working class?
Oh, it's not just Obama. He's part of a whole trend. I think the Democratic Party establishment in Washington, D.C. has for years sung the same song, which is the only way to deal with this in a global economy is have more people going to college, et cetera, more education. I'm in favor of more education. But in fact, people, even college people, we aren't becoming more educated in the broader sense of the word. You know, this book starts out with a whole description of what's happened at the plant level in this country. Instead of making workers more skilled, we're turning everything into an entry-level job for most working people because we want a system set up where people can be dismissed at any time. You talked about temps. Temps, when I was a young person, meant Kelly girls. Then, when I got older, it meant undocumented workers. Now it means college grads who go to work for places like Abbott Laboratories. And they aren't even employed. They're temps who are there day to day. Abbott doesn't even have to fire them. These are people with skills. And yeah, you talk about the Democratic Party talks about education and is just clueless about the fact that there's nobody backing up, watching the backs of these young people, mentoring them, skilling them up. The companies don't have any incentive to invest in them. You know, get real. Until we have a labor movement set up, we're not going to have really the kind of education, the investment in people that we need, because everybody's dispensable. Mm-hmm. That's what has to change.
You know, you also call labor leaders elitist. Why is that?
Did I? It's not that I think labor leaders are elitists. I think that that it's the fundamental problem that the labor movement has is that it's stuck in a very weird system of worker representation. And that's something that I tried to get across in the book. And it's hard to get across even to people who think they know something about labor, and including Democratic Party activists. Our system is really, really, really weird. There are a few analogs, yes, Canada, but in most countries of the world, unions go in and represent not a majority of the workforce, but just the people who want to join. And employers deal with unions on that basis and sign contracts that don't necessarily apply to everybody in the plant, but just the people who are union members, and then the employer voluntarily extends it to everyone else. Most people are perfectly happy to have a union in place, but don't really want to get involved in it. They don't want to take the risk. They don't necessarily want to pay dues. They want to be to one side. They have their lives to live. They can't get involved. You've got to we have a system that requires those people to become engaged when they don't want to become engaged. What we need is to move to organizing and letting workers represent themselves the way they do in all the other countries, or practically all the other countries of the world. Just let unions go in and bargain, even if they don't represent a majority of the workers in a plant. A German labor staffer told me that if we had to get majority votes, 50% plus one, like you do in America, we wouldn't have any unions in Germany either. We have to move towards that sort of model.
Mm-hmm. Now, since labor is so weak and can't really pull off strikes, what can be done to stop the loss of well-paying union jobs, or at least stop predatory corporate practices?
Well, there's not much. There are union jobs. It's only 7 or 8% of this private sector that unions now represent. I think that what we do have to do is talk about organizing people who aren't in unions, and that includes college graduates, because I think the college premium, so-called, isn't worth it unless we have college people organized and getting stronger wages. So this book is an argument for why to do that, and I talked about one idea already, which is allowing unions to start doing what I think labor law allows them to do now, representing smaller, more militant groups of workers, not necessarily the majority of the plant, and disrupt, go on strike. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean going out for 9 months and being replaced. It could mean doing it more like the European way, going out for one afternoon and coming back. what people don't grasp is that you cannot be fired for going out. You can be fired in the United States for any reason at any time. You can't actually be fired for going out on strike. Not if there's, I'm assuming you're not working under a collective bargaining agreement that prohibits strikes. But if you are in the 93% of the private sector workforce that isn't under a collective bargaining agreement, you can walk out if you're working at Starbucks at 8:30 in the morning in rush hour, come back at 9, and if it's concerted activity, you can't be fired. Now, some people will say, well, they'll fire you anyway. They'll just violate the law. Well, some will, and you have to pick your targets and figure out putting enough pressure that makes it more likely, and I'm not arguing that Starbucks or a coffee stand or a McDonald's is the best way of doing it, but there are places where you've got 150, 200, 300, 500 employees in a plant. You have the higher skilled 100 of those 500 start to say, look, we want a union, we want to negotiate, we want higher wages. If you don't, the alternative is our going out for an afternoon next week, and then the week after that. That kind of disruption in a gridlocked republic where you can't really have majority rule, and we don't have it in the United States, and you can't have the kind of welfare protections and labor protections and benefits that people have in most social democracies. That kind of disruption is the only way that we're going to get a change here in the United States.
We're speaking with Thomas Geoghegan, graduate of Harvard Law School, author of a new book, Only One Thing Can Save Us, Why Our Country Needs a New Kind of Labor Movement. Isn't part of the problem that companies don't need highly skilled labor anymore, and besides, they can't get it due to lower education standards? No.
I would say that, if anything, the model that we ought to be skilling people up more. Well, companies are interested in, yes, they're interested in higher skills, but they're not interested in investing in higher skills. And one of the differences between the United States and, say, the Northern European countries, and I'm thinking about Germany and Scandinavia and others, where those companies where they're running trade surpluses and they have much larger manufacturing sectors, is that the companies are investing in the training of these workers. We just talked about the fact that even the higher skilled, college-educated younger workers are coming out and working as temps. No company has an interest in investing in training in a temp. Your value as an employee begins not so much with your college or formal education, but with your education, your training, your backing, your mentoring on the job. We have to create a new corporate model that privileges working people and involves them in decisions and makes them less dispensable. You know, in the United States, you can be fired for any reason at any time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that companies have a reason to invest in workers, because workers are, say, have works councils, union representation, or are even elected to the corporate boards. That's what we've got to change. We have a model that values an economy where workers are unskilled, where everybody's working at entry level. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's more of a political, structural explanation for our problem than it is an inherent economic one. You go over to the other countries and they have much higher skilled workers, even though they have less formal education than we do. That's a function of the system we've set up here.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that way, and it's not necessarily a global phenomenon. In fact, you could argue that we're kind of, once again, America the exception.
And behind the times almost. You state that the country needs a strong labor movement to save the Constitution and our democracy. So why don't Democratic politicians and progressives get in gear behind organized labor? I'm not necessarily arguing for a resuscitation of organized labor. I would say this. I think that everybody in the Democratic Party has a stake in the labor movement, and it's not something that should be left to the highest elected officials in organized labor. Not that they don't have an enormously crucial role in it, but the labor movement belongs to all of us. And that is a very good question that you ask. Why don't they get involved in it? You know, it's much easier to especially in the kind of world we live in where you have to go out for money all the time.
in avoiding confrontation, in avoiding the kind of rhetoric that FDR used about economic royalists and taking on the 1% and so forth. It's much easier to avoid that by talking in the end about education. So Obama gives a speech at Ottawatomie, Kansas, the famous speech where he quotes Theodore Roosevelt, and he should have quoted Franklin, but Theodore was good enough, about the elite taking over the rich. So what is Obama's answer at the end of that speech? His answer at the end of that speech is everybody should go to college. Well, that's not going to happen. And unless it is the Democratic Party decides that it is, or because it's pressured the way it was in movies like Selma back in the 60s, where the Democratic Party was pressured to come out on the side of African Americans for their civil rights, unless the Democratic Party is targeted and pressured to decide which side it's on, unless the Democratic Party is pressured to stop messaging that college is the answer and start addressing a country that is primarily high school educated, unless that is done through strikes, disruptions, situations where the Democratic Party is forced to take a stand, I just don't see any way that we're going to get out of this gridlock. I don't see any way that we're going to mobilize more voters to come into the system to have the kind of majorities that the Democratic Party needs to break the logjams.
The name of the book, Only One Thing Can Save Us, Why Our Country Needs a New Kind of Labor Movement. Thomas Schaller, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Political scientist Thomas Schaller says Republicans have not yet paid the full price for ignoring the middle class. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
How about that Super Bowl game, huh? And today, I've got the final score for you. The Pats 28, Seahawks 24, and Glendale minus $2 million. $2 million, that is. The amount that Mayor Jerry Weirs estimates that Glendale, Arizona lost by having the, quote, honor of hosting Super Bowl XLIX. Lost? Isn't this sports spectacular a magic money machine? That's what the NFL's super slick billionaire owners say as they hustle their big game from city to city, claiming that the lucky host will gain $500 million in added hotel rentals, sales taxes, etc. Independent analysts, however, show that additional spending in a host city actually is far less than super, ranging from about $200 million to as low as $30 million. Moreover, much of that just replaces revenue from regular tourists. And, in Glendale's case, hordes of fans coming to the game chose to stay, eat, and party in Phoenix, so the money went there. And don't forget to subtract a city's added costs, such as thousands of police overtime hours and extra cleanup crews. And while Glendale did have its moment in the global TV spotlight, Mayor Weir is not exactly bullish on any real benefit coming from that. In the long run, he says, down the road, certainly we might break even on this. Meanwhile, the people of Glendale are still paying a heavy price for earlier failed gambles on big-time sports. To stave off bankruptcy, the city has cut workers, street maintenance, library hours, and taxes had to be raised. This is Jim Hightower saying, so look out, San Francisco, Houston, Minneapolis, and other cities next in line to host Super Bowls. One clue into who really wins in these hyped-up deals is that the NFL didn't even offer a ticket to Mayor Weirs. He had to watch the game on his TV at home.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Thomas Schaller explains why Republicans dominate Congress, but will have to fill an inside straight to win the White House. And we say hello to Thomas Schaller, professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and is the author of a new book, The Stronghold, How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. Tom Schaller, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Great to be here, Jim. Thank you.
We appreciate your time. So how do you explain the Republican Party's lock on statewide and congressional seats, but its failure to win the White House in 4 of the last 6 elections?
Well, on the first half of that question, I mean, the Republicans do have something of a built-in advantage, which Democrats complain about, but is not really the Republicans' fault. They tend to dominate smaller state Senate elections, and so the Republicans for the last 30 years or so, as I document in the book, have consistently held a higher share of seats than the number of Americans that the senators from those Republican senators from those seats represent. And that's because Democrats tend to win big population state Senate races like in New York and California, and so the Democrats are arguably underrepresented. But that's, of course, part of the original constitutional design in Article 1 in the structure of the Congress, particularly the Senate. And then, as everybody knows by now, I think, the Republicans have an advantage in House races, partly because of their strategic decisions and their heavy investment in the 2010 elections, which helped them win a lot of governor races and a lot of state legislative chambers so that they could control the redistricting process, but also because, and again, this is not really the Republicans' fault, because of the natural geodemographic concentration of Democratic voters in urban areas and in the inner suburbs. So you put those two together, and the Republicans are effectively overrepresented in both chambers of Congress, relative to their arguably relative to their support levels. Now, why they're losing the White House is a somewhat related question. Of course, the presidency isn't a full national election; it's a series of statewide elections as well. So why aren't they doing better? And part of the answer there, I think, is that a lot of the issues that are working on the state level and on the sub-state congressional district level don't necessarily work as well on the national level, and the Republicans find themselves in a very polarized America with a built-in disadvantage of about 70 or 80 electoral votes because the Democrats have those 18 states plus the District of Columbia for a total of 242 electoral votes that they have now won in 5 consecutive elections. So the Democrats are starting with 90% of the votes needed to get to 270 and only need to put together a couple of states or even just Florida to put themselves over the top. So Republican success down ballot doesn't necessarily translate into success at the top of the ballot.
Mm-hmm. Now, Newt Gingrich was considered a backbench bomb thrower when he arrived in Congress. But since he engineered the Republican takeover, does his kind of radicalism hold any lessons for Democrats?
I think it does to a certain degree, or certain warnings for the Democrats, and I write about at length in the book and about there's a natural asymmetry between the two parties because the Republicans philosophically, whether you agree with them or not, and a lot of Democrats and liberals disagree with them philosophically, they're not necessarily trying to grow and expand the role of the federal government. So for them to use Congress as a vehicle and a vessel to block and thwart and dilute and reverse or retrench, whether it's Obamacare or some other federal policy, is a perfectly natural reflex for them in a way that it isn't for the Democrats. And so some of the things that the Republicans have done since the rise of Newt Gingrich wouldn't necessarily work for the Democrats given their philosophical posture. And at the same time, I'm often warning liberals and Democrats that when they say, oh, this Republican Congress, John Boehner, it's the least productive Congress in the history of the United States, as if it's a criticism, they have to remember that when they say that, that's greeted with welcoming ears by conservatives. They're like, yes, that's exactly what we want. And as John Boehner made very, very plain in a comment on a Sunday talk show a couple years ago, we should judge by the laws we repeal, not by the laws that we pass. And that's a different fundamental philosophical outlook on the role and proper role of representation and members of Congress and the federal government than Democrats and liberals have. And so applying the litmus test that you would say hold to Elizabeth Warren to or Hillary Clinton to in the U.S. Senate is fundamentally different than the one you'd hold Mitch McConnell. And so what seems like a criticism is actually in some cases applause for Republicans because that's exactly what they're trying to do.
So then the paralysis of government in Washington, it can't really be totally laid at the feet of Republicans, can it?
I don't think so. I mean, I agree with Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein when they talk about the broken branch and in their books about how a disproportionate share of the paralysis belongs on the Republican side. They have moved farther to the right than the Democratic caucuses have moved to the left. In fact, analysis of vote scores show that the House caucus for the Republicans, as I mentioned in the book, has moved about six-fold more conservatively over the last 30 years, whereas the Democratic House caucus has moved only about twice as much more to the left, to the liberal side. So both parties are polarizing. They're moving away from each other, and the gap and the chasm between the two coalitions is growing. But that growth of that chasm is driven, about 3 times as much by Republicans moving rightward than Democrats moving leftward. So I think it's fair to say that the balance or the majority of the responsibility lies with the Republicans who, like I said in response to your previous question, they don't necessarily view that as a failure of their governance or a problem. They might actually view it as a success. But I don't think the entire burden of the problem, if you will, of polarization in American politics, nationally or on the statewide level, is solely laid at the feet of the Republicans, even if they deserve perhaps the lion's share.
Yeah. We're speaking with Tom Schaller, professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the author of a new book, The Stronghold, How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. Now, according to conventional wisdom, if an office holder gets too far to one side of the spectrum, he or she risks losing the seat. Why isn't that true of Republicans in the House?
Well, it's decreasingly true of Republicans or Democrats in the House or the Senate. We've really seen this polarization effect on statewide races in the Senate, on in House races especially. So, for example, in the Senate, one of the things I talk about in the book is the number of split delegation states, like, say, Florida, where you have Rubio and Nelson, and one Republican and one Democrat, is not at historic all-time lows, but is very close to that number. Most states, like California, which I mentioned earlier, have 2 Democrats, or Utah have 2 Republicans. And that makes sense. If the country's polarizing and the blue states are getting bluer and the red states are getting redder, and we've only had 10 states in the last 6 presidential elections combined that haven't voted for one party every time or the other party every time, it makes sense if the states are becoming consistently blue in presidential elections or consistently red, that within their Senate delegations and then down ballot toward governors and state legislatures. In fact, after the 2012 election, we had more unified governments, either all Democratic state legislative governments with House, Senate, and state governor, or unified Republican governors than we'd had in 70 or 80 years. So the country is polarizing, and we see that in Washington. Sometimes that means divided government, and then we see it on the state level and sometimes mean unified government. For the Republicans in the House, because they represent very safe, highly gerrymandered seats, really their challenge, and some of them have lost over the years, is in the primary. But once they get through the primary, especially if they're attacked by, say, a Tea Party threat from their right, they're pretty safe come the general election. And this is a phenomenon that's true of both parties, but is increasingly true of the Republicans.
Mm-hmm. You say it might be rational for the GOP not to broaden its appeal, that all it needs to do to win the White House is to get more white voters. Does that explain the Republican push for more restrictive voting laws?
Well, what I say, I don't necessarily agree with that. I discuss some of the arguments made by people like Sean Trende of Real Clear Politics, who say, if you look at the Obama-Romney results in 2012, there are about, by his estimates, 5 to 7 million white voters who, under normal circumstances, should have been expected to turn out. And if those white voters had turned out and broken the same way, which that's an important assumption, broken the same way as the white voters who did turn out, which is majority for Romney, of course, Romney could have surpassed Obama and won the election. I mean, I think in the short term, the Republican strategy is to maximize and squeeze as many offices as they can out of their dwindling white male older voting base. But long term, given the demographic push and the growth and the change in the so-called quote-unquote emerging electorate of millennials, non-whites, unmarried women, and so forth, that strategy is going to be harder and harder to sort of execute. It's sort of like moving to trying to get 2 pair with the last card, to moving to an inside straight, to trying to get a royal flush with the last card on the draw. So Republicans have been getting away with it. Bush loses the national popular vote, but wins the White House because there's an overrepresentation of the smaller states in the Electoral College and the whiter states in the Electoral College by extension. But that strategy, may be working a little bit in the short term, but probably won't work for them in the long term.
Yeah. How likely is it, you think, that radical conservatism can actually turn back the clock to a pre-New Deal nation without protections for the lower and middle classes?
Well, this is a larger policy question, which I don't really get into in the book, but as a columnist for the Baltimore Sun, I write about, rising inequality probably more than any other topic in my Sun columns. And I'm not the only person to write about that. I write about it mostly as a political phenomena, sometimes with the partisan and ideological implications included in those arguments. But you can look at Ross Douthat and Rehan Salam, who wrote a book about the Republicans not really offering a real agenda to middle-class America, to get a critique of Republicans by conservative writers on the other side of the political spectrum from where I am as a liberal, who are saying this exact same thing, that at some point appeals strictly to the 1% or the 10% or the plutocracy, whatever term you prefer. It works, of course, to raise money for the party. It works to raise money for the party's candidates and so forth through trade associations and individual wealthy donors, whether it's the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson. But at some point, it has a declining return because a certain amount of voters become sort of disaffected by policies that seem to be geared solely to the top 10% or the top 1%. Now, so far, Republicans arguably haven't paid the full price of their connections to corporate America and to wealthy donors, and some liberals, certainly far-left liberals, would criticize Democrats for not making these distinctions as clear as they might be, because increasingly, as we know, in the sort of post-Clinton era and the post-Democratic leadership centrism era, there's a lot of corporate money on both sides of the aisle, and oftentimes, in the case of Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, the single biggest donor of any corporation is Goldman Sachs to both candidates, right? So Republicans are increasingly relying on corporate money and increasingly expressive and supportive of the agenda of the top 10% or the top 1%. But as you know, if you're an Occupy Wall Street movement person, you see essentially the two parties as both guilty, although maybe in different degrees, that the Democrats are sort of a partially owned subsidiary of corporate America, and the Republicans are a wholly owned subsidiary of corporate America. So you see that criticism there. And so I think the argument sticks there from the Elizabeth Warren wing of the party that if the Democrats don't differentiate themselves, it sort of provides cloak, it provides cover for Republicans to be a party of the 1%, because they can turn around and say, well, the Democrats are just a party of the top 20%.
Yeah.
It's a real problem, and I think growing inequality is this single most important issue or problem really in the country right now. We're moving gradually toward a third world nation where we have a country of haves and have-nots and a middle class that is declining, and a thriving middle class is key to every historical democracy on the planet. And if we start to lose that because neither party is really minding it, one party unapologetically so and one party connected closer to the unions doing a better job but still needing that corporate money, then we're going to lose something there.
Do the Democrats, and I'll let you go after this, but do the Democrats need to really push the Elizabeth Warren side of things and really go more left, or do they need to come center and try and pull the Republicans back from the right?
Well, this is a great question, and I do think even if one supports Hillary Clinton, I think it's in Hillary Clinton's best interest to get a challenge from the left. First of all, I'm a subscriber to the conventional wisdom that a good challenge makes the candidate stronger. If you remember, in 2008, people were saying that Hillary Clinton was going to weaken Obama and he wouldn't be able to win the general election, and that turned out to be, of course, a fiction. Now, it was a strong Democratic cycle. I think almost any, serious Democratic nominee was going to beat John McCain that cycle, given, the dissatisfaction with Bush and Bush malaise and Bush fatigue and people's unhappiness with the war and the state of the economy. On the other hand, the value of having an Elizabeth Warren or whomever, somebody challenge Hillary Clinton from the left, is I think it will move her in that direction. And she's not very good at talking that talk, and she's stumbled a few times on that count. But I do think it's a good thing for her to talk about economic populism. I think in the end, she's going to run more as a national security state Democrat to prove that she's tough and that she can be trusted with the reins of power and be put into the Oval Office. But I'd like to see her message mixed in with a little bit more economic populism, and I think that will come from the Elizabeth Warrens and that wing of the party.
Okay. Thomas Schaller, professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, weekly political columnist for the Baltimore Sun, and the author of a new book, The Stronghold, How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. Tom, thanks so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to doing it again with you soon.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
You're quite welcome. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Donna Edwards, Congresswoman from Maryland.
One of the big priorities in President Obama's new budget, $4 trillion budget, is repairing America's infrastructure, and particularly with our roads and highways. Nobody knows the need for that better than Congresswoman Donna Edwards this morning, battling the traffic, getting here from across the river into D.C. It's not always that easy, is it, Congresswoman?
No, so far away, but so close.
I know. So good to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, on a very bad traffic day. We had a briefing on the budget yesterday. One of the president's priorities, and he's talking to his cabinet about this afternoon, is getting full funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Why was that left out of the budget, and why is it important?
Well, the president shouldn't have to stick on the budget funding for DHS. This was a holdover in terms of funding DHS from the last Congress. Speaker Boehner promised that he was going to bring it up. The appropriation for DHS actually expires on February 27th. Mm-hmm. That means 280,000 employees. But more important than that, it means that for our domestic security concerns, our homeland, that we are in great jeopardy. And I really don't understand why Republicans are fighting about this. They are mad at the president because he took executive action on immigration. Well, the response for that is for them to put an immigration bill on the floor of the House of Representatives and let us vote on it, but not to hold hostage the domestic security, the homeland security of the United States by not funding the Department of Homeland Security.
And I don't know whether people realize, when you say Department of Homeland Security, you're talking about I'm just trying to think of all the agencies involved, but the Coast Guard is part of it, right?
It's the Coast Guard. So it's all of our border security, and so the complaints about border security, it's our security, the guards who are on the border, on the north and the southern border. It's our Coast Guard. It's all of our, domestic information gathering sector are all comprised within the Department of Homeland Security. Keep in mind that one of the responses to the failures on 9/11 was to create the Department of Homeland Security to consolidate our security interests so that everybody who's supposed to be talking to each other is talking to each other. And now the Republicans are, here we are, from 9/11. We know what the problem was. We see actually what's happened in Australia, what's happened in Paris and around the world, and what the threat from ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, all of the rest of them. And the Republicans are saying, it's not really important for us to fund the Department of Homeland Security because they're having what I describe, frankly, in the scheme of things, as a food fight with the president over taking executive action on immigration, something that every president before him has done. The way to fight this battle out is to put a bill on the floor and vote for it.
Which they have failed to do. I mean, the Senate did pass a bill, but of course that bill is dead now because we're in a new Congress.
That's right. We're in a new Congress, but there's an opportunity. We know what the parameters are, and a bill could be put on the floor of the House of Representatives dealing with the immigration issue already, and we'd get a majority of votes in the Congress to do that. But instead, what Republicans are doing is they're saying, we're not going to fund the Department of Homeland Security because we're going to have this battle royal with the President of the United States over executive action on immigration.
So are they playing games? Do you really think at some point they're going to say to the American people, we don't care about domestic security, we'll just let this agency collapse?
Well, some of the comments that I actually heard recently from some Republicans actually suggest that it's not really a big deal if we don't fund the Department of Homeland Security. Now, keep in mind, many of the employees are essential employees, and so they will keep working. They just won't be paid. Can you imagine that? So going through what we went through, just 2 years ago on a budget fight, shutting down the government, and now here they are shutting down a piece of the government that is really important to our domestic and homeland security. And so I think it's just completely irresponsible. I think the American people believe it's irresponsible, and heaven forbid something should happen in this interim while our enemies actually see that we're having a political fight over whether we're going to protect our homeland.
Right. I mean, the juxtaposition, and you indicated this. So after we saw what happened, the horrible attacks in Paris, and everybody said, boy, we've really got to beef up and protect ourselves against these internal threats. Meanwhile, across the ocean here, right, the Republican Party at this time has said, no, it's not that important. It's really no big deal.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense at all, and especially since a lot of our information gathering and intelligence agencies actually share information and concerns with our European partners. And here in the metropolitan Washington region, our local jurisdictions that are responsible for protecting this metropolitan corridor also do the same thing, and all of that funding is in jeopardy. Irresponsible.
That's one of the first big battles facing this Congress, a battle going on right now, right in the middle of it. Congresswoman Donna Edwards here in studio with us. Should parents have their kids vaccinated against measles?
Oh, my gosh, absolutely they should. I mean, the vaccinations against measles are, it's tried, true, proven. We really had eradicated the spread of measles, and now because of misinformation, disinformation, some parents are not having their children vaccinated, and it's creating a public health crisis for us.
And if they choose not to have their kids vaccinated, do you think the New York Times suggests this morning, fine, then you can't send your kids to public school?
Well, I think that there are rules, and obviously it's up to school districts to make a decision about that. But keep in mind, you wouldn't send a child to school who had meningitis or any other communicable disease, and so you shouldn't send your child to school if they're at risk of getting measles and then having an outbreak that spreads to other kids. Kids die of measles. I mean, it's not you just get a rash and that's okay. Children die of measles, and that's why we went on this vaccination program, not just in the United States but really around the world, to eradicate the spread of measles to keep children from dying. This is a public health risk.
Now, I know you can't think like they do or maybe put yourself inside of their heads, but so why would a Rand Paul or a Chris Christie suggest, well, it's up to parents to decide?
Well, I don't know. I don't want them doing politics with my children, when my child was younger, and I don't think that we should want politicians playing politics with our children's lives and their health and safety, and not just that, but the health and safety of others. So if people want to say, I'll do what I want with my child, okay, fine, you go do that, but don't expose them to my child.
Right. Keep them out of my playground or my school or whatever. President Obama came to Philadelphia last week and spoke to you and your colleagues, Democratic colleagues in the House. How was he received? What's his agenda? And how's it going to fare in the House?
Well, I think the president was well received by our caucus at our annual retreat. I think people were pleased to hear him talking about, really focusing now that we're, through this phase of recovery from the worst recession that we could remember since the Great Depression, and it's time to focus on growing paychecks and continuing to grow the economy for the middle class. And he talked about things like affordable child care. In this country, people are spending more now on child care for a toddler than they are on college tuition.
Wow.
Yes. That's right.
Really?
That is right. Even in our state in Maryland, the average cost for child care for a toddler is almost $13,000 a year, which is really extraordinary. And for middle-class families, they're spending about 35% of their income on child care, more than a mortgage, more than, even more than student loans. And so child care is in a real crisis, and it isn't just about, how do you provide somebody who has a space for a child when they're young and you're working. It's also what kind of environment is that? Is it a learning environment so that we can get our children prepared to enter school, ready to learn early? And that's how we really grow the middle class. And, the president also talked about the need to invest in our nation's infrastructure. I can attest, all of us who live in these metropolitan regions, we need to invest in infrastructure. We had a major accident on our metro station, our subway station here, that resulted in the loss of life because we've disinvested, I think, in general maintenance of our transportation systems. And all of these things grow jobs. Every time that we build a road or a bridge, we're putting thousands and thousands of people to work. And not just the people who are out there with the jackhammers on the asphalt, but, the person who's supplying the food at the meal truck, the person who runs a coffee shop, down the street, and workers stop and get that coffee. It really does build the economy, and it grows the economy. And so the president talked about the need to make those kind of investments. Past this time when we have to, we're worried about reducing deficits. We've reduced our deficits.
Mm-hmm.
Our economy is growing at the rate that it needs to. We are actually creating jobs, 11 million jobs over these last 58 months. But we want to make sure that we're creating jobs so that people get up in the morning and they have more than enough to take care of themselves and their family, and maybe occasionally take a family vacation.
Yeah, it's that middle-class economics,
exactly,
as the president called it, which is the focus, and going to be the focus for the House agenda, I would imagine, a Democratic agenda at least for the
absolutely,
next 2 years.
And it has been. And so the things that the president articulated in the State of the Union and since then are some of the things that he talked about last year. Things like investing in child care and early education, and reducing student loan mm-hmm. debt, and making sure that people can actually afford to send their children to college. This new investment in community college, and the idea. I was with community college presidents yesterday. They were over the top about this and want to see it because why? Because at community colleges, one, they're training more people, but they're people who are getting retraining, who mm-hmm. are learners or kids coming out of high school. They're getting skills that they can put right into the economy. 2 years of community college is a great investment for the United States. And you know what? We make all kinds of tax expenditures, something like $1.4 trillion in tax expenditures, spending in taxes. Most of that goes at the upper income level, the things that we want to get rid of, and some of it goes to, good stuff. Well, let's make sure our tax expenditures go to the things that really build middle-class economics, that build the middle class.
Now, not a lot of time left, but I do have to ask you about a new responsibility you've been given by Leader Nancy Pelosi, head of the Task Force on Campaign Finance Reform. I mean, most people, and we saw last week that the Koch brothers came up with this, they're going to spend $884 million next year. So what can be done about campaign finance reform?
Well, that's why we have to change the system. I'm excited that the leader has invested this responsibility in me, because we have ideas and solutions on the campaign finance arena. And this isn't just about this sort of parochial concern about campaign finances and procedures. This is about the way that we invest and grow our economy, because if we have lobbyists and people who are essentially owned and put there by lobbyists controlling our policy agenda, it means that we're not making investments in early childhood education and all of those things that we care about. And so I'm going to be Democratic caucus with policy solutions, a constitutional amendment to reverse the ills of Citizens United that allow the Koch brothers to spend in that kind of way. Public funding for elections, because if we don't own our elections, it means the other guys do. And disclosing contributions, something as simple as disclosing contributions, we haven't been able to get through the House and the Senate and onto the president's desk. And so we're going to focus on those things and connect those issues to people's lives. And I know that people in my district, when I talk about this, will care about it, because it's about the kind of system that we have, and we got to clean it up.
All right. It is so good to see you. You're just full of energy, and you're on top of all of these issues and right in the middle of all of it. Congresswoman, thanks so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Next time, we'll have the roads cleared.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Thomas Geoghegan, Thomas Schaller, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.